Of the Commonwealth Trade and Investment Summit 2022. Pleasure to see you all bright and early. Well, not that early, but bright at least. We've got a great morning lined up for you, a great day. So, buckle up. There's lots of content coming at you, great speakers. And we are starting with one of the more important issues globally right now, the question of food security. If you've somehow managed to avoid the news over the last 11 months, you'll know that food prices are soaring across the globe. In this country, food price inflation has hit 16.5%. That was back in October, and it's much worse in other parts of the world. So we're kicking off with a discussion around food systems, what's wrong with them, why is food security becoming more of an issue, and of course the all-important question of what we can do about it. Got a great lineup of speakers that will be joining me on stage shortly. We're kicking off with some introductory remarks by Dozie Mmobuosi. I think I got that name somewhat correct. He's the co-founder and CEO of Tingo. Dozie, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dozie Mmobuosi, and the founder of Tingo Inc. Our company is a technology company, yes, but we're all about food security, and that's why this topic is very important to me and to my company. And I thank the staff and also the other council members of the Commonwealth Investment Council. I'm looking forward to speaking, of course, with the few people I've met here today. I usually do not talk too much. I'm hoping to discuss further on this in the coming minutes, I believe. Thanks and welcome.
Yeah. Very to the point. Thank you, Dozie. And no, don't leave the stage. Have a seat. And I'll invite the rest of the panel up to join us. Minette Batters, who is the president for the National Farmers Union of England and Wales. Minette. Martin Davies, he's the head of Naveen Natural Capital. And Brett Graham, a two-star Michelin chef, restaurateur, and owner of the Ledbury. All right. Thank you so much for joining this discussion. As I've just indicated, very topical, very important, and growing in importance by the day. Food security and agriculture is intertwined with sustainability. It's intertwined with the challenge of climate change, and for some time now there has been a discussion globally about the need to change and reform and improve food systems. That has taken on, to put it mildly, renewed urgency in the wake of events in Ukraine, which have demonstrated just how fragile global food systems are and what that means for everyone involved in the process, from the producers to the distributors, to the retailers, and of course to the consumers, who are having to pay more and more money. It's bad enough in this country with food prices spiking. In other parts of the world, like sub-Saharan Africa, where the average citizen spends around 25% of their monthly income on food, you can just imagine what 30, 40, 50% plus food inflation does to a person and the knock-on effects of that. So what we're going to do is have a bit of a discussion around where some of the key challenges are, some of the key problems, but of course also try to speak to the question of what can be done about it. To set the scene, I'm going to give our speakers an opportunity to introduce themselves, maybe provide a little bit more context on where they're coming from and how they are approaching the issue of food security and food systems. And we're going to do that by way of a fairly simple but I think kind of challenging question. I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes each, and it would be great if you can respond to the question and add any perspectives that you feel are really important or relevant to the conversation. Question is quite simple. What's wrong with food systems, and what can be done to fix them? Martin, you have the misfortune of sitting next to me, so you get to go first.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I did think about sitting there, actually, and that was clearly my first mistake of the day. What's wrong with global food systems? Well, I think there's a dysfunctionality which exists in food systems, which really comes from the way agriculture production is structured, how food supply chains have developed, and how our consumers sit. So agriculture globally is a business activity which is in the hands of small, medium enterprises, smallholder farmers. It's very, very fragmented, but it doesn't matter what farm you are farming and where you're farming it. The likelihood is what you're producing is passing through the hands of a much, much smaller group of processors, grain traders, exporters, and then at the other end, that reaches many, many consumers globally. So we have this pinch point in agricultural supply chains, which really causes, in my view, a significant dysfunctionality. The World Bank say that we need $350 billion of capital invested on an annual basis between now and 2035 to deliver sustainable food systems. But of course, we're not just trying to solve the challenges of food security. Alongside that, we have to solve for a massive decline in biodiversity and environment across farmlands globally, and we also have to solve for climate change as well. So the carbon efficiency of food production needs to increase 5-fold. Simple as that. We have to massively reduce the carbon footprint, and we have this dysfunctional model. So that, to me, is really at the root cause of the problem that we need to deal with. I work in the investment industry. The business I run is owned by Teachers Insurance Annuity Association of America. So we're providing retirement benefits for 5 million people working in the education sector. So we have a desire to try and invest in the locations where that $350 billion that I mentioned is needed. But one of the fundamental things that we have to overcome is the risk appetite of some of the countries where the capital is most desperately needed. So I think I've said enough there for a few opening remarks. Give somebody else an opportunity to comment.
Thank you, Martin. So a couple of takeaways there is that the structure of global food systems and the supply chains are not fit for purpose. You didn't use the word, but what I was thinking is it sounds like a bit of a cartel around food systems. Might be a little bit controversial, but very important observation there. We'll unpack that a bit more. Brett, your take on what's wrong and how can we make it better?
Yeah, my sort of view is a bit more domestic and based here. I'm a chef, and I've got a couple of restaurants and also run a farming business. So I've been able to see over the last couple of years, as I've tried to build the farming side of the business up, I've really seen both sides of what happens. I guess a really simple way of me seeing it is that we need to offer less choice to everybody, and we can't change and help impact and be more secure as a country producing food if we don't change. And the huge amount of choice I see in supermarkets for every single cut of meat or every single fruit and vegetable, there's times I think we need to sort of think about, is it the worst thing in the world if we don't have, fillet steak available, as well as ribeye, as well as sirloin, as well as every single sort of cut across the board. And possibly, one of the issues as well is we should be eating more seasonal, and it's obviously a very complex subject, but we've lost that sort of seasonality to all of our food now. And every year, every time someone goes to shop, they want to have the bananas and avocados and tomatoes in the middle of winter. I think part of the change of where I see is making that change is making sure that choice isn't too big and people don't expect those ingredients all year round. Simplest form.
Thank you, Brett. So the need for changing consumption habits,
Yeah.
and also the kind of, what is assumed to be necessary supply of food. I would have no problem with less meat on the shelves. I'm not a meat eater, so they could take it all down as far as I'm concerned, but I know that's a minority opinion, so...
But I also see there's like I know it's a more complex problem that I'm probably sort of explaining it, but I don't understand why we maybe import a certain ingredient like lamb from New Zealand, and then we start a trade deal and start selling it to America. And that doesn't really make sense to me.
Right, so there's some market inefficiencies that you're pointing to there. Dozy, if you had to distill what's wrong with the food system.
Thanks. I won't take it from this angle. I think politics is a problem first. If you look at Africa, where I come from, to be specific, Nigeria, the issue is the infrastructure. Before the produce gets to the market, 60% is rotten, so we have post-harvest losses. Our politicians are unable to provide the infrastructure. What some of us are doing with some of our other businesses is to buy up and then create small processing plants in the locations, and then we begin to save these from tomatoes to yams to potatoes or whatever. We were having a discussion earlier, and I said to myself, the reason I say politics is a problem is Nigeria, for instance, produces over 5 million tons of millet. And millet, they say, is healthier. It's a healthier version of wheat. And Ukraine produces, I guess, over 11 million tons of wheat or whatever. Why should one country, in the first instance, be the only or monopolize the distribution of wheat? So I think the world needs to be fairer. Politicians need to be fairer. And I think governments from across the globe must begin to work together to find practical solutions to these problems. So imagine we have a proper food security council in the world consisting of leaders from across the globe, where you know that Africa has arable land, land enough to produce food for the rest of the world. Why should Africa not be given the opportunity to do so? Why should African leaders to not provide the kind of infrastructure to make food get to the marketplace? So these are some of the things, and I hate to talk about statistics, but the real problem is, look, back in some countries in Africa, if we're talking about food security, we're talking of access, we're talking of nutrition, but nutrition to us here in the UK is, very important, but to some people in some parts of Africa, it's about filling their tummies. It's not about, they don't care about nutrition. So our definition of food security here is totally different. We come here, speak all the English, and go back home and we don't do anything about it. So I think it's high time we started, to be practical about some of these problems. Someone asked me why, the fancy charities from the US fail in Nigeria when they come to distribute polio vaccines. The reason is the communities do not trust them. You need to work, using practical solutions, work with the people on ground, and then you have your solution. So I think politics we need to address how we do some of these things.
You say you hate to talk about statistics. I love it, and I love to hear about statistics. Here's a worrying one for you. The FAO, that's the Food and Agriculture Organization, estimates that in sub-Saharan Africa, close to 25% of the population is malnourished. To your point that, nutrition means is very...
actually way more than that.
Right.
Trust me.
So there you go. Just to underline the severity of the problem. And I think you've touched on a very important dynamic, and this was a question that was going through my mind in preparing for this session, is how is it that disruption in effectively one country in Europe has been able to basically upend global food supplies? I am not an expert on food systems, but it tells me that something isn't quite right if it takes literally one country to go off the rails and suddenly across the globe people can't feed themselves. So we'll definitely get into some of that a bit more, and also the political issue. Minette, your thoughts?
Oh, thank you. Well, very good morning, everyone. I represent 55,000 farmers across England and Wales, and I would say that politics is the challenge the world over, really, for farmers. Look, some of you may have heard it on the news this morning. We have been calling for a food security target to be set by government. We face a massive food security crisis in this country if we don't act. We are seeing 320 million less eggs produced in this country than we were in 2019. You talk about what has happened with the war in Ukraine, and rightly so. If we look at the price of gas, which ultimately affects every farmer in the world and every cost of food production, if we look at the UK, it's 650% higher than it was back in 2019, 650% higher. So that's a huge issue for a wealthy nation like the UK to have an environment whereby we continue to produce healthy, affordable, high-quality food. So the war in Ukraine is a game changer. Those inflationary costs were building during the pandemic, and they are now going to be baked in. And there is a huge issue if we are going to keep people in their countries and not allow a mass migration to occur because people are literally searching for food. And that's going to be a big issue where political leaders will need to come together. And I was amazed, really, at COP27 in Egypt. Egypt massively impacted because it imports so much of its grain. 30% of global wheat is from Russia and Ukraine. We're going to see enormous issues in North Africa if we don't come together. So it really is a time for action. I think the model is incredibly challenging. You raised the point about New Zealand lamb. That's a legal requirement that we took on the EU TRQ, trade policy, dull as ditch water for many, but it's a legal requirement that we took it. So we import 40% of our lamb. We need to export 40% of our lamb, which is why it was going to the US. So it's very challenging, and before you know it, the two areas that you end up talking about are, let's take meat out of the diet, big tick box on climate change, does nothing, really damages Africa actually, which is very, very reliant on livestock farming. It's about where you produce it in the world, and if we don't say take meat out of the diet, we say, well, people have just got to pay more for their food. That doesn't deal with the issue either. So those two things, forget them, because they do not deal with the problem. And we really do need to come together. We are part of the World Farmers Organization, which literally at the table has European farmers, the US, the Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and many African subsistence farmers from across the whole of Africa. Now, that's really difficult to keep them in the room. But I promise you, at the FAO, there was no global discussion on food security. And the only way we've been able to achieve that globally is to get a seat at the table on the World Food Security Committee through the WFO. And we have to keep representing the voice of all farmers across the world. If we allow the world to be run by a few, it will never deal with the whole problem. And we have, I think, a lot of opportunity now in the challenge of global feeding and global warming. We can exchange knowledge like never before. When I was out in Zambia, I had a better phone signal in Zambia than I do here, anywhere here. So we can exchange knowledge in a way that we couldn't. So I would love to think that the UK could really be a global leader in climate smart agriculture, in how we do produce carbon neutral food, feed a growing world population, and deal with the enormous challenge of climate change. Farmers are the solution and not the problem.
Thank you, Minette. Martin wants to follow up on this, but before he does, just a couple of takeaways there. First of all, it is quite worrying, if not shocking, to hear that despite the fairly self-evident urgency of the problems surrounding food systems and the knock-on effects on the cost of living, the link to energy that you've articulated, climate change, etc., 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 that there isn't much of a conversation going on in a place like COP27 around food security. That, to me, pardon the colloquial term, that sounds kind of bonkers. So, I can only echo your sentiment of we need to come together, and the means to do so have never been more effective. But of course, easier said than done. Martin, you wanted to pick up the thread. Yeah,
I just wanted to pick up on the point about meat eating, and I'm not a vegetarian, Minette. I like a good steak like everybody else. But I think there's a really important point there in that, and Brett mentioned that, a lot of food security ultimately is going to come back to consumer choice and what the conscious decisions that we make. So in the Northern Hemisphere, we consume too many calories. Most of us, it's quite evident that we consume too many calories. So we need to eat less. We need to eat less meat. I'm not advocating that we shouldn't eat meat at all, but that really starts at a consumer level. And one of the things which to me is really important from a food security perspective is leadership within the agricultural sector, leadership and education. So education flows right the way down to the consumer. And I don't know that the average consumer in the UK or anywhere globally realizes that by 2050 we need to increase, at the current trajectory, calorie production by 56%, protein production by 100%. And that's using the WRI's recalibrated information, looking at reduced calorie consumption in the Northern Hemisphere. So we all have to make a choice, and we all have to take decisions which ultimately will contribute to some of the food security issues that we have. We should have a steak at the Farmers Club at some time, Minette.
Can I just have a quick pushback? I just find it bizarre that we come back to meat. I mean, the reason we're all getting fatter is actually because we're eating too much sugar and too many biscuits and too much processed food, which doesn't have any meat in it. So you can have unsustainable meat and you can have unsustainable plant-based and grain-based. And it's because we're eating too much processed food, grain and meat in some areas, that's the problem. And it's just very frustrating. You've articulated a good point, but some people weaponize it. And there is a toxic tour de force, effectively, that is doing, I think, a lot of damage to thinking if you take meat and dairy out of a diet, you tick the box on climate change. And actually, what we ought to do is get rid of almond milk, and that would do a lot on the challenges of climate change. So it's a flawed argument, and it takes away what we actually need to be doing. Because you can have unsustainable both, and they're both damaging, and eat less processed food, and eat more lentils and fruit and veg, which none of us eat enough of.
I wish in some parts of my country we could have this kind of debate, about processed food. And see, there's what they call 101. In some villages in my country, people eat cassava in the morning and cassava in the night. It's not even a discussion whether there is meat or whether there is, whatever in it. So this is the balance I'm talking about. I think we need to be more serious about this situation, because people will begin to cross whatever seas to go to Europe or to come to the UK or to go wherever. So if we want to be serious about these things, Africa doesn't need charity. We're talking about collaboration here. I have about over 10 million customers, smallholder farmers that my company deals with. And I'm not even speaking for them, but I know what they feel. Credit, access to credit, for instance, even when the banks go to take credit from the UK and other development finance institutions, I know the kind of conditions they get. So interest rate back in my country is almost 30%. How can a farmer survive on that? So if the world is serious about these things, if we're bothered about food security, or the UK having crisis of food security, we need to then begin to collaborate with financial institutions, other businesses across Africa to find practical solutions. And of course, governments across Africa. We can't continue to just talk when credit is we lack credit in Africa, in Nigeria. We need to begin to look at very practical solutions here. I have nothing against the beef and processed food, but that is the real situation there.
Yeah. Brett, did you want to comment on this, or?
Yeah, I think again, I just think a lot of it comes down to so much choice that we have. As we've got, if I even remember, when I was a boy, my parents would go out for dinner once every 2 or 3 months. And now I think it's accepted that we can go out for dinner 4 or 5 times a week, just as a normal way of life. And, from supermarkets to restaurants to all those things, we just consume so much. And we want something from everything. You go to a restaurant, you could eat 15 different dishes from 15 different parts of the world. And like, I'm only referencing my experience here in England because it's where I've spent most of my professional career. But I've seen that grow so much, and we do need to change and do make our food systems smaller, that sort of chilled transport chain smaller and tighter, and concentrate more on what we're growing here. And you know, one of the things I've got pigs, and one of the farmers I work with had come out of big commercial unit producing, you know, 15,000 pigs a year. And I looked on his sheet the other day, and it was the price per kilo that he was getting for his sows was 75p a kilo. And you know, most sparkling water's double that price in the shops. So I don't understand how that happens. And then I don't understand why we don't eat it in this country and we send it off to Germany and they make hot dogs out of it and sell it back to us. And so I think we need to look within a little bit and see how we can process the food that we eat here in this country. And I don't understand why we can't make sausages here and send it abroad to get it made and then buy it back.
So a few thoughts from my end. First, Martin, I'm not a vegetarian either. I do eat seafood, and nothing against vegetarians, by the way, for any of those in the audience. Minette, I'm glad you made the point that it's sugar that's the problem. I couldn't agree more. There's a lot of misconception around why it is that obesity is becoming an increasing problem, and it is processed foods, without any doubt whatsoever. But also, Martin, I do agree that, and Brett, that I think, and this may sound a bit contentious, but I mean, people kind of eat a bit too much. We don't need to eat as much as is commonly assumed. I'd like to pick up on this issue of the voice of farmers kind of going unheard, Minette. That's something that you put out there. And Martin, you had a similar experience that you were recounting earlier. You were at the UN General Assembly in New York, and you were participating in a session that was dedicated to empowering farmers, and there were no farmers in the room. Counterintuitive, to say the least. What is happening here? I mean, can you break this down a little bit? Why are we talking so much about farmers and not actually listening to what farmers have to say? Because surely if anyone knows what's happening in terms of food production, the starting point should be the farmer. Minette, Martin?
Look, you're absolutely right. I was really struck the other day. We're a apolitical organisation, so I meet with anyone and everyone, and you never know who you'll be working with next, is probably what I would say. But I had a meeting with Sir Tony Blair, who really summed it all up. He said, I've always found farming really difficult to understand. What's the one thing you want? I said, well, there's not one thing. I've probably got a list of 20 things, and that doesn't even start to cover the sides of it. So it's really challenging, even within one country, as to what we want from farmers. And we've got many, you know, I represent 55,000. In Africa, you know, it's a huge part of the infrastructure of many parts of Africa, subsistence farming. So it's very complex, I think, as to how we resolve this. Trade, I'm an ambassador of Farm Africa, which has been an amazing charity in Eastern Africa that has allowed farmers to trade. Particularly if I look at what we've done with coffee, and that has allowed investment to come in, that has allowed clean water, education, sustainability, all because they have access to a market. So there's a lot of things. It's very easy that we end up talking about all the things that are wrong rather than all the things that are right. And actually, if we talk about all the things that are right, that ultimately leads to change as to what needs to happen. But I think having that voice heard is probably the biggest issue. And COP27 spoke volumes in that the voice of farming wasn't heard. And it amazes me, you know, we're having a conversation between the three of us. You are rightly talking about people who it's about food. It's about filling your stomach. You're not fussed whether it's processed, unprocessed, meat, vegetable, as long as you have something to eat. And yet in wealthy parts of the world, we just take it for granted. We waste the equivalent of a continent. We waste the equivalent of China in food. That's how mad it is. There is enough food, but there's a real issue on distribution. So we cannot allow the voice to continue to be unheard. because otherwise global warming is going to drive changes that will make many parts of the world uninhabitable. And we've got to feed this growing population. So I really hope that what has happened in the Ukraine, the atrocities, the horrific nature of it, will be a game changer globally. Wouldn't it be great if we had a different conversation about global food security on the back of that horrendous situation?
Dozy, on that point, Martin, would you like to comment on this? But I want to pick up that thread with you, Dozy.
Okay.
Martin, go for it first, and I'll come back to you.
Yeah. So I was relating the story there about the UN General Assembly, but I've been to the Committee on Food Security in Rome on quite a few occasions, and again, unfortunately, farmers are just not represented in October each year, where food security is one of the principal topics of discussion. The reality is, farmers like farming, and no offense to any politicians in the room, they're not really that keen on engaging with politicians. Minette probably is. So there's a real issue with leadership in the sector. Who is representing the smallholder farmer in Nigeria in the issues that they face? What can solve the issues that they face? So we really do need to encourage leadership and development of people to actually represent farmers, because not all smallholder farmers can turn up in Rome at the FAO and talk about global food security. So it's a cultural thing. And of course it varies a lot when you look across the globe, but to me that's a critical thing that we need to solve for. I'm involved in an organization called Nuffield International. It's a great organization that tries to develop leadership in the agricultural sector globally, and that's what we need. We need farmers to get into the environment, to have a seat at the table, describe what their challenges are, what the practical solutions are, and only, I think in any food supply chain, the only way you're going to solve the problems that food supply chain has is by having collaboration with everybody who's involved in the food supply chain, right the way from the primary producer all the way to the food retailer at the top end of that chain, and indeed the consumer as well.
Dozy, picking up on the point that Minette made around events in Ukraine being enough of a shock to the system to kind of change the game in terms of the conversation we're having on global food security. My sense is that there's a little bit of that happening in the African context. So places like the African Development Bank, they have really started pushing the idea that, look, we need to just up production locally and on the continent. I believe they've set up a $1.5 billion fund. It's obviously not going to fix the problem. Do you think that there's an opportunity here to maybe redefine the parameters? Are you seeing any evidence of that?
Absolutely. You see, the thing with Africa is, let me use Nigeria as, 90% of those producing food are smallholder farmers. So the Dangote farms, and some of us own some big farms, but the smallholder farmers are the core. They do not have access to the kind of credit the African Development Bank is going to give. So what happens is the AFDB gives credit, to the commercial banks in Nigeria, and then they give it to their friends. So it never gets to them. Some of us also now have businesses that are giving inputs and microcredit to these farmers. The practical solution is to deal directly with them. One of the things we have done now, there is the biggest association of farmers in Nigeria called AFAN, All Farmers Association of Nigeria, over 20 million members. We've now taken them on, and we are beginning to onboard them, to do what we have done in the last decade with over 9 million farmers, giving them access to markets, inputs, of course, extension services. And of course, credit is very key to this. We cannot, to be very realistic, we cannot depend on the African Development Bank. We are now beginning to even set up our own agricultural bank, because that has to be the solution. I see myself as an agribusiness entrepreneur, so it's not just about tilling the soil. It's, so that is my constituency, the farmers. And the way to go about representation of farmers is, that's why I'm also here ranting in a very subtle way and trying to talk some common sense.
No, and I appreciate the common sense and the honesty. It's refreshing. A lot of the discussion we're having, for me, what's standing out is that there's sort of just kind of decisions being made that don't really make sense. Systems are operating in a way that isn't quite fit for purpose. And the word that comes to mind is that the world kind of needs to get smarter about how it produces food, distributes food, consumes food. And Dozy, sticking with you on this, one of the potential game changers, and I approach this topic carefully because I don't want to be naive about it, but technology and the application of technology to the agriculture sector is something that could potentially address some of these issues, right? Minette, you made the point earlier that it's never been as possible to access knowledge and information and share. And of course, Tingo is in the business of agri-tech. Could you give us your take on how technology might fit into this picture and might make for smarter systems?
Well, technology clearly is a core part of solving this problem. What we have seen, or the opportunity we have seen as a company is we have taken technology, and very simple technology, because these guys don't need sophisticated technology or complex technology. Technology that must solve problems. As simple as building smartphones that they can understand and providing connectivity so that they can trade. It's not just about chatting on community platforms. I don't want to mention any of these community platforms. It's about localizing what they need, not what they want. So we're using smartphones, that's the technology, to be in their hands. Banks are not in the villages, so the smartphones are everywhere. And banking or fintech applications for financial inclusion are right there. So they're able to do that. So it's not about even, of course, you have tractors. Tractors, of course, you need tractors to be available. But it's not just about tractors. But it's, these smallholder farmers can farm the way they know how to farm best. And when they harvest, they just need to sell to sustain their lives. So I think what we are doing as a business is the solution, providing that technology to give them access to finance, access to markets so that they can survive. For now, at this stage, it's about survival. Then at the macro level, we can begin to talk about export for Nigeria to diversify from, oil and gas, for instance, which is, I don't say that as bad, but we need to begin to diversify, so that's at that level. So of course, technology is the core, but very simple technology, not technology that...
not AI algorithms or...
No.
Right. So access to markets and access to credit, right? Two key issues. Would anyone else like to come in on this? Smarter systems, the need to kind of just be smarter about the process.
Well, I think you make a really important point on the role of innovation and the ability to share it. And a really good example of that would be actually what the UK set out to achieve in 2011, which was to be a global leader in antimicrobial resistance on the back of the world facing an apocalypse, that we will not have the antibiotics to deal with future infections. And a lot of this is the role of use of antibiotics in the livestock sector, and the ability now to be able to share, if we are sick and we need antibiotics, we know now that we have to take antibiotics very seriously and very differently to how we treated ourselves in the past. It's exactly the same with livestock production. We have to use much less antibiotics, and we have, in this country, in the last decade, we have lowered antibiotic usage by over 50%. That's a massive plus for every single person in this room, and we now have the ability, as you have said, through the smartphone, we can share all of that technology, all of that innovation that is coming online as to how we farm with a much lighter footprint, effectively, but one that delivers. That's just a really good example of something that will transform human health. And we mustn't ever lose sight of all of that. I think we focus so much on affordability of food and how cheap food is. I have faced into so many conversations about, we just want to have cheaper food. Well, no, we want everybody to have better food, and things like antimicrobial resistance That really should be a big global discussion, and so often it's not. And the UK has provided enormous leadership on the back of what Lord O'Neill did in 2011. So don't let things like that sort of not get heard again, because most people won't know anything about that, and they should. And we can share all of that now with farmers right across the world. That's brilliant for human health, but it's brilliant for animal health too.
Martin?
Yeah, so we have some just monumental challenges to face globally in the agricultural sector, but I think we can take heart in the fact that we have technology which can help us solve a lot of the problems. So whether it be virtual reality, or augmented reality, robotics, artificial intelligence, remote sensors, drones, and so on. Because of the nature of agriculture, it's primary production, it's dependent on the weather, the interaction of the plant, the animal with its environment, it lends itself to the impact of technology. So technology is a game changer, but technology needs investment. And I go back to the point I made that the World Bank say agriculture needs $350 billion on an annual basis. So the population of Nigeria in 2100, I think, is 750 million. That's what the FAO say anyway, so it must be right. So with that level of population growth, the productivity of the farmers in Nigeria, so there's some structural things, there's policy, but you need the availability of that technology to get beyond that basic level of calorie production and then to increase productivity. Technology means that we're less reliant on synthetic inputs. The title of this panel was Resilience. If we're reliant on synthetic inputs, we don't have a great deal of resiliency in what we do, because Minette made the point about fertilizer and gas prices and alike. So we have to adopt technology as quickly as we can, and it's a game changer, but we need that because we have monumental challenges to face.
Brett, we're soaring comfortably at around 30,000 feet. To kind of bring this a little bit more down to earth, what are you seeing in terms of the kind of direct impact that the cost of living crisis that we're seeing is having on individuals like you, people who are in, day to day in the business of farming, the business of feeding people? Is it having much of an impact? How are you having to respond? How's the wider industry that you're in having to respond to what's happening? To give us a bit of a sort of tangible sense of what it all means.
Yeah, I mean, my restaurant's a fancy restaurant, and it hasn't really been affected, I guess, by the cost of living crisis, which is directly correlated to our clients. But the price of everything, as you all know, has gone up. We've had to respond to staff shortages like every industry probably has. I'm not quite sure which country the staff have gone to, but everyone I speak to around the world has got no staff. And that's hard. And I guess what we do in the, retail sector in terms of a restaurant or a shop or whatever, we respond to those challenges by putting our prices up because we have to, otherwise we don't survive. I think the problem that I've looked at into the farming side of things you just asked about is how do we redress a problem where farmers are speculating a year or 2 or 3 years in advance and then getting paid on a volatile market that is set by other people, because they just wait to see what they get. And sometimes it works in their favor, like probably arable farmers are celebrating this year with some sort of higher prices, but they might not be celebrating next year when their inputs have just doubled or tripled, and they're not going to see what that market's going to present to them. And then looking probably on the farming side a bit more is with the trade, how we trade with other countries and how supermarkets and retailers buy ingredients from other countries. And sometimes those countries have environmental and agricultural standards that would be illegal here. And then we're using those countries to drive the price down for farmers that are producing here. I think that's slightly unfair, and maybe there's a way, you probably know far, far better than me, how we can address that issue where there's a level playing field for producers who produce in a certain country using chemicals that are illegal here, and farming practices which are definitely wouldn't even come close to the agricultural standards we set out for our farmers to follow in this country. And so we're at a disadvantage here when we start trading against countries who maybe offer a cheaper price to produce the same product, but we have to, by law, do it in a different way. So maybe you've got a better idea than me about that. But I just thought that seems to be a really strong issue that farmers are going to face going forward.
Huge issue. Fairness, level playing field, is what has to happen, but it's very difficult to achieve. And the power within supply chains. I mean, the retailers here in the UK are enormously powerful. It's illegal for me to talk about price. I've had our legal team lecturing me all morning, do not talk about price in the media. In America, totally different competition law. They can talk about price routinely. We can't talk about price. So there's massive issues that you refer to about how we established a level playing field in all of this.
Martin?
Yeah, that's a more general problem, is equitable distribution of what a food supply chain makes at the various points in the supply chain. So as I was diligently doing my research for this panel, there was a report literally only released last week, I think it was by Sustain, and it's entitled Unpicking the Food Supply Chain. So this is UK related, but a farmer in the UK who's producing milk that goes into cheddar is receiving 0.02% profit margin on the milk that they're producing. A farmer producing beef burger, Minette, you'll definitely be eating it, I'm not sure that we will. 0.03% margin, bread 0%, apples 1%. So now, if you think about a supply chain, who is taking most of the risk in the supply chain? It's the primary producer. So why is this such an unequitable distribution of the margin in that supply chain? And that's not UK, that's everywhere you go. And this is the point I go back to at the start. You've got a disconnection between many, many farmers and many, many consumers, and there's a piece in the middle which is a constriction in how that supply chain functions. And we need to try and use technology to connect consumers more closely with farmers. Maybe that's possible through blockchain, or maybe it's less sophisticated things than that. But I do believe that ultimately some of this does come down to consumer choice and preference.
We have 10 minutes left, and this being the Commonwealth Trade and Investment Summit, we have to bring in the Commonwealth and the extent to which, as a group of countries, a family of countries, the Commonwealth can be at least part of the solution here. Pretty big question. Does anyone have any thoughts on how the Commonwealth might be able to catalyze some of the action that we need to see? We've got the English and Farmers Union of England and Wales next to a tech entrepreneur from Nigeria in the agri-tech space. There seems to be some obvious synergy there. Any thoughts?
Well, for me, the Commonwealth is supposed to be about Commonwealth for member states. I think we need to do more. The movement of goods and people, I feel it's still not very fair. People can't move from Nigeria to the UK freely. Goods can't move from Nigeria to the UK freely. We need to be talking about that now. So if the UK can easily, of course I know there are standards, and I know that there are companies who meet the standards. All the certifications are available in Nigeria, but I'm still wondering why we don't find easily made in Nigeria food on the shelves here in the UK. I live here in London, but of course I don't go to the stores myself, but I know they are not really available. Because when I send my house manager to look for these things, I have to go to a proper African store to get food, because that's all I eat here in the UK. So we need to do more about movement of humans and goods. So if really we're Commonwealth, I think that's what we should be doing.
Appreciate the honesty. Martin?
So the only two Commonwealth countries that I invest in are Australia and New Zealand. They are agriculturally very advanced with adoption of technology. And one of the things which you see every place you go to, farmers learn very well off other farmers. And I think one of the things that the Commonwealth should really have the aspiration to do is we've been talking about the impact of technology, We should really try and have some ambition to have sharing of best practice across Commonwealth countries, because I acknowledge the fact that subsistence farming in sub-Saharan Africa, and incidentally, I've never met a farmer anywhere who likes to be a subsistence farmer, so non-government organizations need to stop thinking that that's an important way for farming to exist. But we need to try and encourage sharing of best practice information, technology adoption across the Commonwealth. Maybe there are ways that the countries like the UK can take a lead in that, but to me that's one of the things that I don't think enough of that happens, quite honestly.
I've just been given the signal that we need to wrap up. So, closing remarks. I want to give each of you just 30 seconds or so. If there's one key message you want to put out to the room and beyond the room, what is that key message? I mean, I feel like we've touched on some of those, but if you could just distill down one key issue when it comes to food security and resilience in food systems, what would that be? Any volunteers? Yeah? Minute.
And you did it again. You did the one key issue, and I said I will have 20.
That in itself is a good answer, I think.
And therein lies the challenge, that there is no one thing, but there is a lot of things that, I mean, I think everybody in this room, from every country, continent that you are from, we share an ambition that we have to come together and do it differently. So it is about hearing the voice of farmers. Within the FAO now, on the World Food Security Committee, farmers do have a voice. It's the only time they've had a voice. Previous to 4 years ago was when they got their voice. Previous to that, the world's farmers had no voice at the World Food Security Committee at all, and they do now. So I think things are changing, and I think events are going to force change. Mm-hmm. And that's the big difference now. So politically, it's interesting that, Rishi Sunak in August committed to a new food security, self-sufficiency target, a legal framework to underpin it. No prime minister since the Second World War has done that in the UK. Now, it has to happen. That was August, this is now, and we've had a prime minister in between. So events are going to change things. But I guess what I would leave everybody thinking is just do not take your food for granted. I think you see stark difference in this panel with those that can never take food for granted, never know where the next meal's coming from, and we just waste so much of it because it is so cheap. And raising food prices here is not going to deal with the issue, but just value your food, because we can buy it 24/7. You can buy whatever you want, whenever you want. I mean, that is amazing. And if you go back to 1947, we were only 30% self-sufficient. So, food matters, and don't take it for granted. And together, I think as Commonwealth countries, we can drive change.
Very quickly, because we are up against the clock. Dozy?
Okay, I'll be very brief. I think we all need to go home and think again about what we've said here, the politicians in the room. I think I'm going to pass it on to you. We need to do better, or you guys need to do better. I'm not a politician, so that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Dozy.
Yeah, and I guess on my side, just a final remark would be that no matter what country we're in, I think we need to support the people who actually make the food. And we can talk about all the other big issues, but if we get back to grassroots and support those who wake up every morning when we're still in bed and go and feed their animals and tend to their crops and whatever else they have to do all day, every day, they're the ones that we need to reward.
Great. And Martin?
Well, to follow on from that point, those farmers need capital to invest in their business to improve the efficiency of what they do. So politicians, government, please work to try and find ways in which investors can overcome some of the risk perception that they have for investing in the countries where capital is needed most. I work in the investment industry. I want to invest in agriculture because it's not correlated with the economic cycle. It's an inflation hedge, low volatility returns over time, But if I talk to the average pension fund who I manage capital for, they say, oh, I don't like the risk profile of that particular country. And the only way you overcome that is by government, politicians, a collaboration to find measures to deal with the risk profile and get to a risk appetite level that your average investor is happy with.
Thank you. To sum up very briefly, big topic, complex, difficult, a lot of moving parts to it. Two messages that really resonate. I think what Minette said is don't take your food for granted. Couldn't agree more. But also that one way or the other, I think there are significant forces afoot globally right now that are going to force some changes, whether we like it or not, whether the politicians like it or not, be that climate change, be that what we're seeing happening in Ukraine, be that migration. This issue isn't going to go away. Prepare for more. I hope that we have provided some food for thought, pardon the pun, and a little bit of insight into what is going on in global food systems and how they might improve. Please join me in thanking the panel for the discussion. Now, I kindly